Welcome to the Russia Brief, our monthly online discussion on issues about Russia and the region, a project of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies here at Georgetown University, and supported, of course, by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. I'm Jill Dougherty. You know, I thought a lot about what we should call this episode, and it's going to be about Russia-U.S. relations, U.S.-Russia relations. And if we'd held this discussion about a year ago, it might have been pretty straightforward. In fact, I'm pretty sure that everyone in the audience would be able to give us the list. Strained diplomatic relations, to say the least, the war in Ukraine, the end of nuclear arms control, Americans wrongfully detained, held in Russian prisons, etc. But today, it seems, if possible, even more complicated, because we have all of those issues. But in addition, we have a war in the Middle East, Iran supplying drones to Russia and backing militias that are attacking US forces in Syria. We have North Korea supplying ammunition to Russia and North Korean weapons being used by Hamas. I'm already confused. So we're calling this the Rubik's Cube of Russia-US relations. And to help us sort this out, we have our guest today, John Sullivan, U.S. Ambassador to Russia from 2020 to 2022. He is a partner at Mayer Brown's Washington, D.C. and New York offices, and he co-leads the law firm's national security practice. He's also a distinguished scholar at the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. So welcome, Ambassador Sullivan.
Thanks, Jill. It's great to be with you.
Fantastic. Okay, well, this is going to be an interesting discussion. We may be all over the map, but I think there's a purpose to it. So we are going to have a discussion for about a half an hour, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And as usual, you can put those in the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. Ambassador Sullivan, I want to start with the Middle East because it is so in the news right now, and it's extremely serious. Russia and then the Soviet Union before it had a very long history in the Middle East. You also have 1.3 million people who left Russia or the Soviet Union for Israel. They're living there. They're an influential political group. So let's look at how Vladimir Putin is, let's say, what is his strategy on what's happening in Gaza and in Israel? Where is he? What does he come from, and where is he going with his strategy?
Well, thanks, Jill. Yeah, you've set the background well for the changing Russian relationship particularly with Israel. I recall when I arrived as ambassador, and Prime Minister Netanyahu was in office then, left office, and now is back. But he had cultivated a close relationship with Vladimir Putin, visited Moscow. There was a dual U.S.-Israeli citizen who was in trouble in Russia, and the Israelis told me to butt out, that they'd handled it, and they did with President Putin. For all of the connections that you've cited between Russia and Israel, it was a close relationship, particularly for a country, Israel, that is so closely identified with the United States. At the start of the war, the Israelis were not as supportive as I think the United States would have liked in our approach, and not just vigorously opposing the Russian invasion, but supporting Ukraine. I attributed that to the prior continuing close relationship between Israel and Russia, and plus the Israeli interests in Syria. And keeping a lid on things in Syria, where the Russians are, of course, involved. So there were a lot of connections with Russia, Jill, that have now, after October 7th, I think, been snapped or come close to it. We now have, the Russians have always had relations with Hamas, but bringing a member of the Hamas Politburo to Moscow recently statements they've made about deploring the Israeli military assault in Gaza in graphic and critical terms. I think this has gone a long way to fracture what was a closer relationship. But it's complex for Putin. He's got Russians in Gaza, and the foreign ministry over the last few days has been celebrating the release of Russians, or the exit from Gaza of Russians. Russians killed in the Hamas attack, some potentially taken hostage. The Russian perennial problem going back a long time of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence within Russia, which we've seen. So it creates a bit of a complicated mess for Putin, but one that ultimately he's going to try to leverage and take advantage of in what I characterize as his overall war against the West, and it's across the globe. It's not just in Ukraine.
Yeah, and speaking of that, if you back up to the old Soviet days, the Soviet Union had a close relationship with liberation movements around the world, and Hamas wasn't around at that time, I believe, but certainly, the Palestinians, the PLO, they supported that. And now I think you could argue that Putin is resurrecting that history and saying, hey, developing world, global South, remember us? We're the people who supported liberation movements around the globe. We still do. And the colonial powers in the West do not. And so we're standing up for you against those colonial powers. It's interesting the way that narrative has come back, 30 years later, 40 years later.
Sure. I mean, Putin just spoke to, you talk about relationships from that era, the close relationship between the Soviet Union and Egypt. And Putin spoke yesterday or 2 days ago to President Sisi of Egypt. But the larger message that you hit upon, Jill, is this idea that Russia supports the global South, is a force opposing the colonial powers in the West. Of course, Russia itself, over its history, has been among the most aggressive with imperial conquests and colonizing other peoples whom it oppressed and continues to. But never the Russians, one thing I've learned is they never let facts or law or morals get in the way of the political argument they need to make. And the political argument they're making is that the United States and its vassals in NATO, the EU, and the Pacific are struggling to maintain a global system that is has collapsed. This so-called international, the international order that was created after the Second World War, that's collapsing, and we, the U.S. hegemon, are struggling to maintain our influence, which we will fail at. Russia, on the other hand, is in the vanguard. It is very much like Comintern language, in the vanguard of the anti-colonial struggle of the peoples of the global South. We're not with the golden billion in the West. We're supporting the rest of the world and their struggle against the United States hegemon.
Yeah. And, I was going to talk about China because today she and Biden are going to be meeting in San Francisco. However, you mentioned colonialism, and I think it's really ironic, might be the word, that you have the same situation, essentially, colonialism taking place in Ukraine with Russia's war against Ukraine. I mean, many would argue that really is a colonial war, keeping the part of the Soviet Union at bay, away from the West. So it seems logically that those two ideas, we support liberation movements, but we want to take over a country that now is independent, would conflict. So how does Putin put those two ideas together?
So he doesn't draw this historical connection, but I'll take a stab at it. The same way the Soviet Union did. So the Soviet Union, through the Warsaw Pact, in August of 1968, had something called Operation Danube, which was an invasion of Czechoslovakia. Hundreds of thousands of Warsaw Pact troops, thousands of tanks to suppress the so-called Prague Spring by the Czech people, Czech and Slovak peoples of what was then a single country, Czechoslovakia. They arrested the Czech leader, Duke Czech, put him on a plane, brought him to Moscow, re-educated him, sent him back to Prague, and ultimately banished him to Bratislava to be a forest ranger. But the rationale, and it's mostly developed after the fact, is what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. It was fraternal assistance, fraternal intervention for fellow socialists who were sure they could have some sovereignty in their country, but they basically had to stay on the straight and narrow socialist path. And as fellow socialists, international socialists in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern European countries, they were obliged to intervene and correct that mistake. The euphemism they used was fraternal assistance to our socialist sisters and brothers in Czechoslovakia who were going astray. That's basically, Putin has tailored this to a 21st century Russia, which is not a communist state, but it ties into his Russian nationalism and his Russian imperialism and the way he views Ukraine. Sure, Ukraine can have some autonomy, but they're part of our Ruski Mir. They can't just, cut ties with us and join NATO or join the EU. And if they do, we'll provide a little fraternal assistance to our Slavic brothers and sisters in Ukraine. And Putin's euphemism is a special military operation, not fraternal assistance the way his Soviet predecessors, what they called their military intervention in Czechoslovakia. How was that consistent with either his claim of Putin's claim today of being somebody who respects international borders, the rights of people to self-determination, etc.? He can't. It's a wild inconsistency. Just as Brezhnev had the same problem in '68, but those types of logical consistencies and legal issues, they can, nothing that can't be rolled over with the treads of their tanks.
And as some people have pointed out, those old tropes actually do work in some cases in the global South, because people do remember that the Soviet Union actually did support those liberation movements. But
Sure.
Let's move on. Let's move on to China. We have, the meeting today in San Francisco at APEC, and big picture, we have the relationship between Russia and China expanding, deepening, etc. And yet, but Biden is meeting with Xi, obviously developing his own relationship, the United States relationship with China. So in this kind of game of chess that we're putting on the table here, how is the United States positioning itself to deal with Russia discreetly, China discreetly, and then Russia-China?
Well, the way the administration has described it in its national security strategy is that Russia is the immediate kinetic threat. We've seen that with the war launched in Europe. We've seen that with the Wagner group in Syria, Libya, Central African Republic. China is, the administration would say, or national security strategy says, is the larger generational threat to the international system that the United States and the Soviet Union and other allies after the war founded. And we could go through the litany of complaints that everyone from Donald Trump to Joe Biden have with how China has conducted itself in that international system, in the trading system we have. But the relationship between the United States and China is fundamentally different from the relationship between Russia and China. If we focus on the Russia-China relationship first, which, by the way, they're commenting on, the Russian state media are commenting on over the last few days, poo-pooing, downplaying APEC. They've sent a deputy prime minister overture, whom I've met several times, principally focused on economic issues, has lived in the United States, fluent English speaker, but they've sent a deputy prime minister, not even Mishustin himself, to come. So they're downplaying this and saying nothing to see there, folks. Folks meaning the Russians who read and pay attention to their state media. Nothing's going to happen there. Xi recognizes the United States for the decaying relic that it is. But for the Russian relationship with China, it's grown closer from both sides' perspective, Moscow and Beijing. Since I started as deputy secretary in 2017, we saw a more joint military exercises, but they weren't quite joint. They weren't like NATO military exercises where all the different national militaries are integrated. They were sort of parallel military exercises and not integrated. They disclaim having a military alliance. In fact, they disdain that. They say we're not about Cold War alliances against other countries. But it's really a dependent relationship. Putin is so dependent on Xi, and that's what we've seen. So it's different. The Biden-Xi relationship in the Biden-Xi meeting, that's not a meeting of equals either. I think the United States, both with its continued strong economy as compared to what's happening in the PRC today, overall economic heft, and our global military reach is still, something China aspires to. But those in the United States government who study this are concerned that China is going to be, is approaching being a real peer competitor and threat in some ways to this global system that Biden is trying to protect and expand. The whole theme of the foreign policy of the Biden administration is reinvigorating those alliances on which the United States depends. And Xi is trying to fracture those, expand Chinese influence, including its military, which is why it's seeking bases in the Indian Ocean and on the Atlantic in Africa. So the President Biden's got a lot to contend with in Xi, but from a much different from a much different approach than Putin has, who is in some ways more supplicant than Biden would be.
Yeah, I just want to remind our audience that if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A function. And if you could identify yourself, that would be great. Let's move on to Iran, because Iran now comes in so many different areas. But let's back up. Russia used to be a partner with the U.S. in supporting diplomatic efforts to get Iran to give up its nuclear weapons program. Moscow supported restoring the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And now it looks as if that's over, at least at this point. And Iran, as we've said, is supporting these militias that are attacking U.S. forces that are in Syria, and then the United States taking action against that. So, well, let's back up. We always want to look at the U.S.-Russia relationship. So how is the United States dealing with Iran, maybe out of the corner of its eye, looking at the Russia relationship with Iran? It's a very, to me, it looks very complex.
It's complex and troublesome, problematic, to say the least, for the United States. So again, as with the Russian relationship with Israel, the Russian relationship with Iran, which, by the way, doesn't thrill the Israelis, has changed even since I became ambassador in 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago. As late as September 2021, we were still engaged with the Russians in serious discussions to try to get Iran back into the JCPOA. I recall meetings in mid to late September. It was just before we started to get the first serious intelligence indications that the Russian troops that were being massed and their security services and so forth were being massed and were on the verge of attacking Ukraine. That was toward the end of October. A month before, we were still meeting with the Russians productively, we thought, on Iran and the JCPOA. Now, we knew that Russia wasn't aligned with our overall view of Iran, but there were still opportunities for us to talk. And we in the United States hoped for progress. Fast forward from mid-September 2021 to mid-December 2021, which is in the day it was December, I think it was 15th, the day that I was given the 2 draft treaties that the Russians had drafted for the United States and NATO. This is now, there's a drumbeat that there's going to be a war. Putin's pushing it. They give us the 2 draft treaties that same day, that same moment, and there was a car, a diplomatic vehicle with an Iranian flag on it at the MFA for meetings with the Russian Foreign Ministry. One of our we have a set of so-called Moscow rules on how we operate in Russia, the U.S. mission. Some of them are written down and extensively. Others are just more informal rules of thumb. And one of those leading Moscow rules is there are no coincidences. That was a sign that they were talking to a country that the United States considers hostile and adverse, that has killed many Americans, American service members in the last several years. So we had the Soleimani strike. I had just left as deputy secretary. That was first week of January 2020, a retaliatory Iranian strike on U.S. bases, principally al-Assad in Iraq. And we had U.S. service members injured. It reminds me of the stories we've seen recently about the attacks on U.S. military facilities in Syria and Iraq, where nobody was killed, and the initial report was nobody injured, but then we've got a growing number of service members who report TBI, traumatic brain injury. Same thing happened in January of 2020. So fraught, tense relationship between the United States and Iran. Closer relationship now, much closer between Russia and Iran, and the support, mutual support. The Iranians for the Russian special military operations with drones, ammunition, and so forth. More high-tech assistance from the Russian side, from the aerospace forces and others, to develop the Iranian, ballistic missile program and fighter weapons.
Could we turn to, and I want to remind people, questions, because I do count on this audience, which is very astute when it comes to Russia, to come up with good questions. So please put them in the Q&A function. And in a few minutes, we'll go another 5 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to some questions. But, I wanted to move to another part of the world, which is the Caucasus. This is not my particularly strong suit, but who could ignore the fact that just recently you had Azerbaijan attacking Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan, as I understand, flushed with weapons from Turkey, which is a NATO member, and then they seize Nagorno-Karabakh. I remember waking up one morning and coming to the realization that Nagorno-Karabakh doesn't exist now, as the entity that we knew. And
Right.
and yet, you would think this is the backyard of Russia, so Russia must be involved. But actually, Russia was kind of diplomatically not present. They certainly didn't have much of a role there. So it's their neighborhood. Why did they seem so weak at that point, diplomatically, at least?
Yeah, well, diplomatically and militarily, there were Russian peacekeepers on the ground in Nagorno-Karabakh, and in fact, within Armenia itself, who basically stood aside and let the final conquest of Artsakh, or as the Armenians call it, or Nagorno-Karabakh, go forward. And you're right, it doesn't exist as a dotted line on the map anymore as territory. Nominally Azeri territory that was being run by Armenians. No more. The Armenians, virtually all of them, were forced out back to Armenia. But I'd contrast that with in November November of 20, when I was ambassador, there was really the first wave of violence, of military action by Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, and inflicting fairly substantial defeats on the Armenian forces. The Russians were much more involved diplomatically and militarily, hosting Aliyev and Pashinyan in Moscow. Pashinyan is the Armenian leader, Aliyev, the Azeri leader. They were really in charge. There was an international group that included, it was the United States and France, that was had traditionally been involved in a group that discussed issues concerning Nagorno-Karabakh. We had some meetings at the MFA. There's a U.S. representative. There is now, there was then, but it was really the Russians were in charge. That's all changed, in part because of the special military operation, in part because of Armenian disgust at the lack of support from what they considered their ally, protector in Russia. The Russians aren't happy that the Armenians seem to be getting closer to the United States. I just saw that I think Pashinyan is not going to a leaders meeting of the CSTO countries, which Peskov has lamented, and he wasn't. They're usually pretty harshly critical of the Armenian government these days. It's more of a lament this time. But it's a problem for Putin and Russia that Armenia is, which, Lavrov himself, I believe it's his mother, is Armenian. I mean, the connections between, we go back to, the USSR and the connections between Russians and Armenians, historically very close. But, to come back to the war in Ukraine, I'd make the larger point. The problem for Putin is, and it's a continuing problem, and it's in Ukraine and with this conflict in the Caucasus, and it's the fallout from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Putin, of course, as we all know, has said that the fall of the Soviet Union was a great geopolitical catastrophe. Not because of the demise of the communist system. He often says, if you don't have some nostalgia for how we lived back in the day, back in the 60s and 70s, and in the era of the Soviet Union, you don't have a heart. But if you want to go back to the Soviet system, you don't have a brain. No, the geopolitical catastrophe was that enormous landmass of the Soviet Union had an international border around it. And there were internal borders of the Soviet republics, but those were all ultimately controlled from the center, from Moscow. When the Soviet Union dissolved, that large, long international border dissolved, and those internal boundaries of the Soviet republics became international borders. And they separated Russian, in Putin's view, his people, his Ruski Mir in Ukraine, but they created problems for him in the Caucasus as well, in Georgia, with Abkhazia and Ossetia, and with Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. It was easier to control back in the day when it was the Soviet Union and these were internal boundaries. A lot more difficult and challenging for him when they're international borders. Doesn't mean he won't take on the challenge, but he does so because he says it was all the mistakes of his Soviet predecessors, starting with Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine, as he calls it, and Khrushchev giving Crimea to Ukraine, fiddling with the internal borders of the Soviet Union, that when the external border fell, created big problems for him and his Ruski Mir.
Yeah. Well, we have a couple of questions, and one of them is following up on something you just said. This is from Svetlana Grenier, who is with the Slavic Languages Department. And she says, when Russia put the draft agreements on the table in December 2021, and the ambassador says the invasion was in the air, what was the U.S. thinking in turning them down? Was there a chance to prevent the invasion of Ukraine at that point that the U.S. did not take up?
Yeah, great question. One that I've thought a lot about and have a very firm view on. That was pure theater. Handing those documents to us, VV had already decided this was going forward. This was pure theater to give the MFA, the Kremlin, Putin, justification. We tried, but the US rejected us. Now, what's my evidence for that? Well, first, the texts of the treaties made such outrageous claims on the United States and NATO that I forget who it was, somebody once said these weren't negotiating documents. These were, this wasn't an attempt at diplomacy. These were public ultimatums and the opposite of diplomacy. But to give you some sense in the background of why I'm so confident about saying this was how the MFA approached this. Just the little things, the signals that show they were not serious from the get-go. So I walk in, I'm handed these two documents, and usually when we exchange documents, the United States and the State Department and the MFA, we, the United States, provide our official version in English and provide as a courtesy a translation in Russian. They do the opposite. They provide an official version in Russian and a courtesy English translation. They handed me two documents that look like, as we used to say back in the day before computers, dictated but not read, not really negotiating documents, and only in Russian. And having handed me the documents, they then said, I have a lot of respect for him, Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov. Having handed me the documents, and by the way, our Assistant Secretary Karen Donfried was there, the two of us, they said, this was a Wednesday, they said, this is an urgent matter for us, these two documents, and we would like to negotiate, Russia would like to negotiate these two documents with the United States on Friday in Geneva. And on Friday, we will make these two documents public. And I said, wait a second. So that's in less than 48 hours. it's going to take me time just to have these translated so that Americans back home and myself too. The questioner is in the Slavic language department. I am not a Russian speaker. I tried and failed. My lessons went very badly. I said, this isn't serious. This is important to us. This is an emergency. We want to negotiate in less than 48 hours on these documents. And it didn't come up with quite as direct a connection, but it was eventually in the conversation. This is such a crisis. If we don't solve this, it will be worse than the Caribbean crisis. And by then I knew when the MFA says Caribbean crisis, they mean the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we've gone, to quote an old car commercial, we've gone from 0 to 60 in this conversation, from what I would have thought was going to be a conversation about the Minsk agreements and political issues and reform in Ukraine to a nuclear standoff between the United States and Russia. Here are two documents. We want to discuss them in 48 hours. In 48 hours, we're going to make them public. And if you don't want to meet, we'll say you don't want to meet. Is that serious diplomacy? I don't see how you could make the case. And going forward then, where we took the documents seriously, it took us some weeks with the intervening holidays in the United States and in Russia. But we met in at least in multiple forms, bilaterally, in something that what we call the Strategic Stability Dialogue. My successor as Deputy Secretary Wendy Sherman meeting with Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov at the NATO Russia Council at the OSCE. And we ultimately presented, about a month later, I presented a lengthy document on behalf of the United States that was a response. And that was a realistic response and a negotiating document that was trying to bring the Russians back to a discussion about their concerns with NATO, NATO's presence in Eastern Europe, weapon systems, and so forth. And in every one of those meetings, the Russians spoke from canned talking points and never engaged. They never engaged in any what could be considered, good faith dialogue. And I cite that meeting on the 15th, that how they presented the documents, the terms on which they presented them. It wasn't just hardcore Russian negotiating tactics. It was a public ultimatum that would be used to justify the special military operation on February 24th.
Yes. Okay. There's a question from Yana Pashaeva, and the question is, does Russia take advantage of the war between Israel and Hamas? Now, we kind of got into that, but maybe there's a little more to explore here. Is it, trying to let's say, score some points from here, and if it is, how is it taking advantage of that war?
Well, my gut reaction whenever I get a question like this is to say they would if they could. There is no the interests of the Russian Federation and this is their term, the civilizational struggle that Russia is engaged in with the West. There is nothing, because the Russian civilization is at stake. There is nothing they wouldn't do to defend the Russian civilization. If they could leverage the horrific Hamas attack on Israel to protect the Russian civilization, of course they would do that. Whether there are massive civilian casualties in Israel or Gaza, what does it matter when Russian civilization is at stake? Now, there are constraints on what they can do. Some of them are logistical. We've seen reports, I've seen reports, I have no idea whether they're true, to take it with a grain of salt, that, that Wagner-like entities have been supplying weapons to Hamas. I don't know logistically how that happens. Maybe not. Certainly diplomatically, the Russian Federation has not been a supporter of Israel. And finally, the support that the Russians are providing to Iran, Hezbollah, Assad in Syria, it's really turned on Israel. And I attribute that not to an independent Russian view on what the right outcome is in the struggle between Israel and Hamas, or Israel and the PLA. It ultimately comes back to Putin's overriding goal, which is prevailing in what they describe as a civilizational struggle. They use that phrase. They issued last year, maybe it was earlier this year, a so-called foreign policy concept paper. And at the very start, they talk about this is a civilizational struggle. There's a Russian civilization that is under siege, been attacked by the United States and its vassals. That's the principal focus of the Russian government and Putin today. Anything that helps in that struggle on either side, Israeli or Hamas, they will use for the benefit of Russia in that struggle.
There's a question from Matt London about Ukraine. And it's jibing with what I wanted to get into with you next. Where does Ambassador Sullivan see the Ukraine-Russia war going? Does he expect Biden and Xi to discuss it, as Xi is the only possible source of influence on VVP, Mr. Putin?
Right.
And then he adds, if we move to peace negotiations, could Russia buying Crimea from Ukraine with money frozen in the West be part of a solution? So let's start. They're going to, Biden and Xi going to discuss it. And what about this idea that, we could use frozen Russian money to buy Crimea? What do you think?
I start with the premise, going back to my last answer. This civilizational struggle that Putin is engaged in, the prime focus of it is reclaiming that what he calls their historical lands in Ukraine, and that's more than Crimea and the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, the five, if we include Crimea, new republics that have been absorbed into Russia. He won't stop. He will not stop. He has maintained from February 24th, his speech at 6 o'clock in the morning, the goals of the special military operation are to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. He's not deviated from those goals, and my view is he will not deviate from those goals. So we can talk about, and it's appropriate to do so, to talk about potential political solutions, ceasefires, and so forth. But any notion that there is a permanent resolution that doesn't, I've said for years, and I used to joke with Secretary Blinken, because we'd be asked all the time, where's the off-ramp? And I'd say, if you want turnpike analogy, Putin, he doesn't want an off-ramp. He wants a rest area. He wants the Vladimir Vladimirovich rest area on the turnpike, but he's not taking an off-ramp. So you can negotiate a ceasefire. You can give Putin hundreds of billions of dollars, but whatever agreement he signs is not worth the paper that it's written on. He is not going to surrender. If there's one thing I've learned, is to take him at his word, and he will not surrender in denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine. So where does that leave us? Where does this war end? At best, I mean, I've seen the debates about, is there a potential Korean solution as there is on the Korean Peninsula? I guess that's in theory possible. It's hugely expensive. Just think about what the United States commitment is on the Korean Peninsula to continue to enforce that peace over the last 70 years in support of our South Korean allies. The only way that type of solution, call it a long-term ceasefire, whatever, the only way that works is by continuing to support Ukraine militarily, financially, basically at the same rate we are now. And if we're going to do that, Ukrainians might as well be taking back their own territory. And oh, by the way, Zelensky doesn't have, at least at this point, to my knowledge, doesn't have the political support, even if he wanted to, and I'm not saying he does, but even if he wanted to, he wouldn't remain as president. Yeah, I go back to the first day of the war, and I've probably mentioned this to you, Jill. I'm sure you saw it. There's this famous video of a woman in a city I'm going to forget the name of it, on the Sea of Azov, just north of Crimea, who confronts Russian soldiers who have come up from Crimea, have occupied her city, her small city, and standing in the city square. And she's calling them fascists and occupiers. And she holds up a fistful of sunflower seeds to one of the soldiers and says, "Here, put these in your pocket. So when you die, when you're killed here and you're buried, something good will come out of your presence." What Putin has done with the special military operation has taken a country, Ukraine, which had, as people on this call know, many of them better than I, enormous affection, connections to Russia, native Russian speakers like Zelensky himself. But the brutality of what the Russian government has done has made that type of peace a real stretch at this point.
Yeah. One more question about Ukraine. There are some reports that the United States is quietly asking Ukraine to show that it's willing to negotiate with Russia. No specifics, but are you willing to negotiate? And what is your opinion? What do you think? Is that a wise policy? Should the United States be doing that?
I don't know if the United States is doing it. I know that my former colleagues, both at State and at the NSC, are good at contingency planning. It may be that they are, preparing for scenarios, actually pressing the Ukrainians to negotiate with the Russians. Zelensky has said he will negotiate with the Russians. He's got a list. I think there are 10 points that are, from his perspective, non-negotiable about Ukrainian territory, justice for those who've been for the thousands of Ukrainians who were civilians, innocent people who've been brutally killed in war crimes. I get back to the point that we can push the Ukrainians all we want, but Putin says if we cut off our supply, and I think Secretary Austin said this, if we just cut off our supply, the United States, to what extent would the European countries and others continue to support Ukraine? I don't know. Some probably would. Nothing near the support they're getting now. And it would be difficult at best, for Ukraine to continue to resist, as they are today, on the front line in the Donbass. But that doesn't mean they will surrender. What we'll get to is what I thought was going to be the situation in Ukraine after the special military operation started. I was convinced, virtually to a moral certainty, that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine. The only question was when. I was equally convinced, maybe not as certain, but if you'd asked me on February 25th, I'd say, there's just no way the Ukrainians are going to be able to resist successfully. With all that's happened now, and I joke with our mutual friend Fiona Hill given our Irish heritage and yours as well. I draw parallels to Ulster. You know, there's bad blood here that even if the militaries have some sort of formal ceasefire or disengagement, people are going to be whacking each other and blowing each other up there in retribution for a long time until they think there's been justice for the crimes that have been committed.
Yeah. Yesterday, in fact, I was speaking with some Ukrainian officials, and they were saying, and it was kind of interesting, they're very grateful for all the help the United States and the West are providing. But two of them said this phrase, as long as it takes, Biden's phrase, U.S. is in there as long as it takes. They both took, were criticizing that and saying that implies that this can go on forever. And what they're saying is it should be over as quickly as possible. And that the United States, obviously, this is the debate.
Same thing the administration is saying about Gaza. Be over as soon as possible. Defeat Hamas, but get it over as soon as possible. Not Israel as long as it takes.
Yeah, and yet, you have the administration saying as long as it takes. Right. So does that kind of leave it open in a way? I mean, I know this is rhetoric, it's a theme, but does it leave it open that, this will just go on indefinitely, which is a problem domestically here in the United States?
Yeah, it was a verbal crutch, rhetoric that was used to avoid having a longer discussion with the American people about what was at stake in Ukraine. As long as it takes, this is too important. What I've heard from members of Congress, and I've spent a lot of time talking to members because I feel very passionately about this, about what's at stake in Ukraine and why the United States should continue to support Ukraine. The administration, starting with the president, hasn't, until recently at least, with his address after the October 7th attack on Hamas, provided a straightforward explanation to the American people about why it's important to the United States that we support Ukraine in resisting this aggressive war that Putin has launched. So, as long as it takes, it's not a policy, and it's not really effective rhetoric. And what I hear from members and what members and senators are saying to administration officials is, give us the rationale for why we should, my heart. And I've had members of Congress say this to me, Republican members who were asked the same question you did, Jill. Tell me why. I'm inclined. I get it. I want to do it, but I've got to explain this to my constituents. So give me the arguments. And the administration has been slow to give those members the arguments. They just thought that we were going to spend $100 billion plus on an annual basis to support Ukraine, and that doesn't make sense. We need a better strategy and an explanation of that strategy, why it matters.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. We have about 5 minutes left. So I wanted to ask you, I know at Georgetown, we're both over at Georgetown. I'm teaching a course as well. And you have this meeting, which eventually I'm going to make, that you call Valdai West, because Valdai, as we all know, is that once a year meeting with President Putin at Valdai, north of Moscow, and bucolic setting. I've been at it many times, and President Putin waxes on for sometimes 3 and 4 hours, giving his ideas about the world and the meaning of life. And so I'm sure that your conversations are pretty broad-ranging too. But are there any things that we who are watching Russia and the region should be looking out for? I mean, you're talking with students who are really involved in this issue. They're looking at issues and things that they want to that bother them or that they're worried about. So give us a couple of red flags that we should be looking for in the next 5 minutes, if you could do it, in the near future with Russia?
So, well, thank you for the publicity for our Valdai West group. It's a terrific group of students, mostly graduate students. It's drop-in, it's open, it's no registration needed at the CERES suite at SFS. And the discussion it's just topics in Russia today, basically, and it's usually the Russia-Ukraine war, but in recent weeks, of course, has expanded just as the conversation we've had. We have a conversation around that conference table, a dozen of us or so, every Tuesday. That's just like the conversation that we're having today, except they're not only extremely well informed, as I say, mostly graduate students, some undergraduates, but some of them are from Russia and Ukraine or Eastern Europe or Central Asia. So they bring a perspective from home of what they hear from their families. And it's quite sobering, particularly for, we have Ukrainian students at SFS. So, it's a skewed perspective in some sense, because we the group of us all obsess about this. But we went through an interesting exercise. I was having dinner with a group of about 14 Republican members of Congress a few weeks ago to talk about support for Ukraine. And I started with my Valdai group trying to plan in advance, and each student was assigned to be a Republican member and hit me with the best questions they could on, why should we spend tens of billions of dollars when we're not spending money on X, Y, and Z in the United States? And it was a useful exercise to go through for all of us. And ultimately, none of our positions changed. We were all, I think, to a person, supportive of Ukraine, but it does require an explanation. It's not just as long as it takes. It's not obvious that we, the United States, should be involved as directly as we are. There's no doubt about that. As directly as we are. There are no U.S. troops troops in contact in Ukraine. But it's very close support for the Ukrainian government, and not, for example, in a bloody war that happened in Ethiopia, what's happening in Burma. Now we're involved with the violence in Israel and Gaza, but trying to make consistent policy here and do what's right. And what's right, as I focus on it on Ukraine, is supporting Ukraine. It's challenging. So it was a useful exercise. And for those in the Georgetown community, university, SFS, or others, I invite you to come. Maybe we'll have to find a larger conference room to meet in if we get more students involved.
Great. Well, I'm going to definitely try to join. I'll give you a tough question. Okay, well, we're out of time, unfortunately, but this is great. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sullivan, for this whirlwind trip around the issues that deal with Russia and the United States. Thank you very much. And thank you to our faithful audience for their questions and for listening to this. And of course, thank you to the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. And finally, all of the support that we really, really appreciate from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So we'll see you at the next Russia Brief. I guess that would be in December. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.